What if I told you there's a story so strange, so controversial, that it has baffled scholars, inspired legends, and sparked debates for thousands of years? Hidden within the ancient pages of Genesis lies a passage shrouded in mystery. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It speaks of beings called the sons of God, their forbidden actions, and the rise of a group known as the Nephilim. Who were these figures? Were they angels, tyrants, or something else entirely? The Bible doesn't give us all the answers, at least not directly. But when we piece together clues from Genesis, the New Testament, and even Jewish traditions, an intriguing picture begins to emerge. This isn't just about theology. It's about understanding humanity's earliest struggles with power, corruption, and morality. Why does this story matter today? Because it forces us to confront timeless questions. What happens when the divine intersects with the human? And how do we make sense of evil in a world created by a loving God? In this video, we'll unravel 7 key insights that shed light on this cryptic passage. From the identity of the sons of God to the role of the Nephilim, we'll explore interpretations that might challenge everything you thought you knew. So buckle up. This journey through history, scripture, and imagination is just getting started. What if I told you there's a story so strange, so controversial, that it has baffled scholars, inspired legends, and sparked debates for thousands of years? Hidden within the ancient pages of Genesis lies a passage shrouded in mystery. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It speaks of beings called the sons of God, their forbidden actions, and the rise of a group known as the Nephilim. Who were these figures? Were they angels, tyrants, or something else entirely? The Bible doesn't give us all the answers, at least not directly. But when we piece together clues from Genesis, the New Testament, and even Jewish traditions, an intriguing picture begins to emerge. This isn't just about theology. It's about understanding humanity's earliest struggles with power, corruption, and morality. Why does this story matter today? Because it forces us to confront timeless questions. What happens when the divine intersects with the human? And how do we make sense of evil in a world created by a loving God? Let's begin by diving into Genesis 6, 1 through 4 itself. These verses are short, deceptively simple, yet packed with implications. The text reads, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." Then comes the startling statement. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. At first glance, it seems straightforward, but look closer, and you'll find layers of complexity. Who exactly are these sons of God? Are they literal angels descending from heaven to interact with humanity? Or could they be symbolic representations of godly men from the line of Seth, contrasted with the ungodly descendants of Cain? Some suggest they might even represent tyrant kings or mythical figures whose stories became intertwined with biblical accounts. Each interpretation opens up new possibilities and raises even more questions. Consider the idea that the sons of God are angels. This view aligns with other parts of Scripture where the phrase sons of God explicitly refers to heavenly beings. For instance, in the book of Job, we see the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. Similarly, Daniel describes angelic entities in ways that echo this terminology. If true, then Genesis 6 paints a shocking scene. Spiritual beings leaving their eternal domain to take human wives, producing offspring who defy the natural order. But why would angels do such a thing? Was it rebellion, curiosity, or something darker? On the other hand, some argue that the sons of God are simply righteous humans, perhaps descendants of Seth, marrying into ungodly families. This interpretation emphasizes moral decay rather than supernatural intervention. The union between Seth's line and Cain's line symbolizes the corruption of pure worship, setting the stage for the flood narrative that follows. In this reading, the Nephilim are not giants or superhuman beings, but merely powerful warriors or leaders whose exploits became legendary. Then there's the third perspective, that the sons of God are mythical heroes or tyrant kings. Ancient cultures often attributed extraordinary qualities to their rulers, blending history with myth. Could Moses have been referencing these traditions to convey a deeper spiritual truth? Perhaps the focus isn't on who the sons of God were, but on what their actions represented: pride, disobedience, and the blurring of boundaries between the sacred and profane. As we unpack these interpretations, one thing becomes clear. Genesis 6 is far more than a historical account. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's ongoing struggle with temptation, power, and identity. Whether the sons of God are angels, humans, or mythical figures, their story challenges us to examine our own choices and allegiances. What lines are we willing to cross? How do we define righteousness in a world filled with compromise? And most importantly, what lessons can we draw from this enigmatic chapter? This is only the beginning of our journey. Together, we'll explore 7 key insights that illuminate this passage, connecting dots across scripture, history, and tradition. By the end, you'll see Genesis 6 not as a riddle to solve, but as a profound meditation on the intersection of the divine and the human. So stay with me as we delve deeper into the mysteries of this ancient text. Now, let's shift our focus to one of the most debated phrases in this passage: the sons of God. These 4 words have sparked centuries of theological discussion, cultural storytelling, and even artistic expression. What or who are these beings? And why does their identity matter so much to understanding Genesis 6? To begin unraveling this mystery, we must first consider how the term sons of God is used elsewhere in Scripture. In the Bible, this phrase often refers to angelic or heavenly beings. For example, in the book of Job, we read about the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord, clearly describing a divine council of spiritual entities. Similarly, in Daniel's prophetic visions, we encounter references to angelic beings who serve as messengers and warriors in God's heavenly realm. These examples suggest that when Genesis speaks of the sons of God, it might also be pointing to angels rather than humans. But why would angels descend from heaven to interact with humanity? The idea seems almost fantastical, yet it aligns with other biblical accounts of supernatural intervention. Angels appear throughout Scripture, sometimes delivering messages, guiding people, or executing judgment. Yet Genesis 6 presents something far more unsettling, a departure from their intended purpose. According to this interpretation, these angels didn't come to aid humanity. They came to corrupt it. They abandoned their celestial roles, crossed boundaries meant to separate the sacred from the profane, and pursued relationships with human women. This act of rebellion wasn't just disobedience. It was an attempt to disrupt the natural order established by God. This perspective gains further support from later writings in the New Testament. Both Peter and Jude allude to Genesis 6, describing angels who sinned by leaving their proper dwelling and engaging in immoral behavior. Their actions are likened to the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah, where humans similarly overstepped divine boundaries. These parallels reinforce the idea that the sons of God were indeed angels, and their sin had catastrophic consequences for humanity. However, not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Some scholars argue that the sons of God should be understood as godly descendants of Seth, contrasting with the ungodly line of Cain. In this view, Genesis 6 isn't about angels at all, but rather a symbolic representation of moral corruption, spreading through intermarriage between righteous and unrighteous families. While this explanation avoids the supernatural elements, it raises its own set of questions. If the text is purely metaphorical, why use such specific language, sons of God, that elsewhere points to heavenly beings? Why frame the narrative in terms of divine rebellion if the focus is solely on human morality? Another intriguing possibility lies in ancient Near Eastern traditions. Many cultures told stories of gods or demigods mingling with humans, producing offspring who became legendary heroes or tyrants. Could Moses have been drawing on these motifs to convey a deeper spiritual truth? Perhaps the sons of God represent tyrant kings or mythical figures whose exploits became exaggerated over time. In this reading, the emphasis shifts away from the literal identity of the sons of God and toward the broader theme of humanity's fascination with power and dominance. Regardless of which interpretation resonates most, one thing remains undeniable. The actions of the sons of God marked a turning point in human history. Whether they were angels, humans, or mythical beings, their choices led to widespread corruption, violence, and chaos. Genesis 6 sets the stage for the flood narrative, where God intervenes to reset creation and preserve a remnant of righteousness. It's a sobering reminder of what happens when boundaries are ignored and authority is misused. As we reflect on the identity of the sons of God, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Are we too guilty of crossing lines we shouldn't? Do we pursue power, pleasure, or pride at the expense of others? And how do we respond when faced with temptations that challenge our values and faith? The story of the sons of God isn't just an ancient tale. It's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with obedience and rebellion. By exploring this enigmatic phrase, we gain insight into the complexities of human nature and the divine plan. So, as we continue this journey, keep asking yourself, what can this mysterious chapter teach us about who we are and who we're called to be? As we delve deeper into the mystery of Genesis 6, it's time to turn our attention to a critical piece of evidence that has shaped centuries of interpretation: the New Testament's perspective on this ancient passage. The apostles Peter and Jude didn't just reference Genesis 6 casually. They wove its themes into their warnings about sin, judgment, and the spiritual forces at work in the world. Their words provide profound insights that connect the dots between the Old Testament narrative and the broader biblical storyline. Let's start with 2 Peter 2:4-5, where the apostle writes about angels who sinned and were cast into chains of darkness, awaiting judgment. Notice how Peter links this event directly to Noah's flood, framing it as a pivotal moment in history when God intervened to address rampant corruption. He doesn't go into great detail, but his language is unmistakable. These were no ordinary beings. They committed acts so egregious that their punishment was severe and eternal. This aligns perfectly with the idea that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were indeed angels who abandoned their heavenly estate for immoral pursuits. Peter's inclusion of this reference underscores its significance. It wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of rebellion against God's order. Jude echoes this sentiment in his brief yet powerful letter. In Jude 1:6-7, he explicitly states that certain angels did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling. Like Peter, Jude connects their actions to the sexual immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah. Here, we see a clear parallel. Just as those cities violated divine boundaries through unrestrained lust, so too did these angels transgress by pursuing forbidden relationships with human women. Jude's message reinforces the gravity of their sin while tying it to humanity's own moral failures. It's a chilling reminder that rebellion, whether from angels or humans, always leads to destruction. But why do Peter and Jude emphasize this connection? Why bring up Genesis 6 in letters addressing early Christian communities? The answer lies in their desire to warn believers about the dangers of compromise and false teachings. Both apostles were writing during times of intense persecution and doctrinal challenges. False teachers had infiltrated the church, promoting licentious lifestyles and undermining core truths about holiness and accountability. By pointing back to Genesis 6, Peter and Jude reminded their audiences that such behavior wasn't new. It had roots stretching all the way back to the pre-flood world. The consequences then were catastrophic, and the same would hold true if believers failed to resist similar temptations. This brings us to another fascinating layer of interpretation: the role of angels in biblical theology. Angels are often portrayed as God's loyal servants, carrying out His will and protecting His people. Yet here, we encounter a darker side of angelic activity, a rebellion so profound that it disrupted the harmony of creation itself. This duality highlights a central tension in Scripture: the coexistence of good and evil, obedience and rebellion, even within the spiritual realm. When angels stepped out of their assigned roles, they introduced chaos into the world, contributing to the moral decay that ultimately necessitated the flood. Some critics dismiss the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6, arguing that it conflicts with Jesus' statement in Matthew 22:30 that angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage. But this objection overlooks an important distinction. Jesus was speaking about the nature of angels in heaven, their eternal state, not what might happen when they leave that state. Genesis 6 describes a situation where angels deliberately abandoned their heavenly domain to participate in earthly affairs. Their actions weren't sanctioned by God. Instead, they represented a direct violation of His design. The New Testament's support for the angelic view adds weight to its credibility. However, it also raises thought-provoking questions about free will and responsibility. If angels, created as spiritual beings superior to humans, could fall so far from grace, what does that say about the fragility of morality, even among those deemed holy? And if their sin contributed to humanity's downfall, how much more should we guard ourselves against allowing pride, lust, or rebellion to take root in our lives? Ultimately, Peter and Jude's reflections on Genesis 6 serve as sobering reminders of two truths. First, no one, not even angels, is immune to the allure of sin. Second, God's justice prevails over every act of rebellion, whether spiritual or human. As we continue exploring this passage, let these insights shape your understanding of its implications. What lessons can we draw from the sins of the past to fortify our faith today? How can we remain vigilant against the subtle ways temptation seeks to corrupt our hearts and minds? By examining the New Testament's perspective, we gain not only clarity about Genesis 6, but also a renewed appreciation for the depth and coherence of Scripture. Together, these texts form a tapestry of truth, weaving together history, prophecy, and theology to reveal the timeless battle between light and darkness. So as we move forward, keep asking yourself, what does this ancient story mean for my life right now? And how can I live differently because of it? Now, let's address one of the most frequently raised objections to the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6, the statement by Jesus in Matthew 22:30. There, Jesus declares that angels neither marry nor are given in marriage in heaven. At first glance, this seems to contradict the idea that angels could have taken human wives and fathered children. But is it really a contradiction? Or is there more to the story? To understand this fully, we need to explore the distinction between what angels are and what they do when they step outside their designated roles. Jesus' words about angels not marrying refer specifically to their eternal state in heaven. In their heavenly domain, angels exist as spiritual beings without physical bodies or biological functions. Marriage and procreation are uniquely human experiences tied to our earthly existence. Angels, as far as Scripture reveals, do not participate in these activities because they operate within a different framework, one defined by service, worship, and obedience to God. This doesn't mean, however, that angels are incapable of interacting with the material world. Throughout Scripture, we see countless examples of angels appearing in human form, delivering messages, performing miracles, and even eating food, as in Genesis 18. These interactions demonstrate that while angels are fundamentally spiritual, they can temporarily assume physical attributes for specific purposes. Genesis 6 introduces a shocking twist. Some angels chose to abandon their heavenly estate, not just to interact with humanity, but to engage in sinfully intimate relationships. This act wasn't part of God's design. It was a deliberate rebellion against His order. When Peter and Jude describe these angels being cast into chains of darkness, they highlight the severity of their transgression. Their punishment suggests that these beings didn't merely disobey, they crossed an unforgivable line by corrupting the natural boundaries between the spiritual and the physical realms. This makes sense when we consider the broader context of Genesis 6. Their actions led to widespread moral decay on earth, setting the stage for the flood narrative. So, how does this square with Jesus' teaching? The key lies in understanding the difference between angels' nature and their choices. Just because angels don't marry in heaven doesn't mean they're incapable of assuming physical forms or engaging in behavior contrary to their purpose. Think of it like this. Humans aren't naturally aquatic creatures, yet we can dive underwater using scuba gear. Similarly, angels aren't bound by biology, but they can temporarily adopt physical characteristics to carry out missions, or in this case, to commit acts of rebellion. This brings us to another crucial point: the role of free will among spiritual beings. Scripture portrays angels as having agency, capable of making decisions that align with or oppose God's will. Lucifer's fall from grace serves as the ultimate example of angelic rebellion. He wasn't created evil, he chose to exalt himself above God. Likewise, the angels mentioned in Genesis 6 made a conscious decision to leave their proper dwelling and pursue forbidden relationships. Their choice wasn't a reflection of their inherent nature, but rather a perversion of it, a rejection of their divine calling. The implications of this rebellion are staggering. Not only did these angels disrupt the natural order, but their actions also had devastating consequences for humanity. If the offspring of these unions were indeed extraordinary individuals, whether giants, warriors, or leaders, their presence likely contributed to the violence and corruption described in Genesis 6:5. Humanity's downward spiral into wickedness wasn't solely its own doing. External forces played a significant role. This adds another layer of complexity to the biblical account, reminding us that sin isn't always isolated. It can ripple outward, affecting entire communities and generations. At the same time, this story challenges us to think deeply about the responsibilities that come with freedom. Angels were given immense power and authority, yet some abused it. Humans, too, have been entrusted with incredible gifts: reason, creativity, relationships. But history shows how often we misuse them. What safeguards do we put in place to ensure we don't overstep our bounds? How do we resist the temptation to pursue self-interest at the expense of others? Finally, Genesis 6 reminds us that God takes such transgressions seriously. The flood wasn't just an act of judgment, it was a reset, a chance for creation to start anew. Even so, God preserved Noah and his family, ensuring that righteousness would endure. This balance of justice and mercy underscores the heart of God's character. He holds all accountable, whether human or angelic, but he also provides a way forward for those who remain faithful. As we reflect on this aspect of Genesis 6, let's consider its relevance to our lives today. Are there areas where we've stepped beyond our rightful roles, pursuing power, pleasure, or pride at the cost of integrity? And how can we cultivate humility and obedience in a world that constantly tempts us to stray? By grappling with these questions, we gain a deeper appreciation for the lessons embedded in this ancient text and for the enduring truths it offers to every generation. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most enigmatic terms in Genesis 6, the Nephilim. Who or what were these mysterious figures? The text provides only a brief description, referring to them as the heroes of old, men of renown. Yet this fleeting mention has sparked centuries of speculation, debate, and even myth-making. To truly understand their role in the biblical narrative, we must carefully examine the clues within Scripture while separating fact from fiction. The word Nephilim itself is intriguing. It appears only twice in the entire Bible, once in Genesis 6:4 and again in Numbers 13:33, where spies sent by Moses describe seeing giants in the land of Canaan. Many scholars believe the term comes from a Hebrew root, meaning to fall, which could imply that the Nephilim were either fallen ones or those who caused others to fall. This dual meaning adds layers of complexity to their identity. Were they agents of chaos, embodying the corruption spreading across the earth? Or were they simply victims of circumstances beyond their control? One common misconception is that the Nephilim were the direct offspring of angels and human women. While this interpretation gained popularity through apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch, the Bible never explicitly states this connection. In fact, Genesis 6:4 mentions the Nephilim both before and after the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of humans. This timeline suggests that the Nephilim existed independently of those relationships. They weren't necessarily the product of supernatural procreation, but rather a distinct group known for their extraordinary qualities. So, if the Nephilim weren't angel-human hybrids, what made them so remarkable? The text describes them as heroes of old, men of renown, indicating that they were legendary figures whose exploits left a lasting impact on history. Some scholars propose that the Nephilim were ancient warriors or leaders whose strength, wisdom, or achievements elevated them to near mythical status. Their reputation might have been exaggerated over time, much like how modern cultures celebrate larger-than-life icons. Others suggest that the Nephilim represented a class of powerful rulers who dominated societies through force or influence, contributing to the moral decay described in Genesis 6. Interestingly, Moses doesn't dwell on the Nephilim in his account. Instead, he includes them almost as an aside, assuming his original audience would already know who they were. This implies that the Nephilim were well-known figures in the ancient world, perhaps part of oral traditions or regional legends. By referencing them briefly, Moses may have been emphasizing their prominence without needing to provide extensive details. For readers today, however, this brevity leaves room for interpretation and imagination. Despite the lack of clarity in Scripture, later Jewish writings expanded on the concept of the Nephilim, often portraying them as monstrous giants born from angelic unions. These accounts, while fascinating, should be approached with caution. Works like the Book of Enoch are not considered canonical by most Christian traditions, and their embellishments stray far from the biblical text. Still, they reflect humanity's enduring fascination with the unknown and our tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with elaborate stories. What can we learn from the Nephilim's inclusion in Genesis 6? First, they serve as a symbol of humanity's obsession with power and legacy. Whether they were literal giants or metaphorical representations of human ambition, the Nephilim remind us of the dangers of pursuing greatness at any cost. Their rise coincided with a period of widespread corruption, suggesting that unchecked pride and dominance inevitably lead to destruction. Second, the Nephilim highlight the tension between earthly fame and divine purpose. Being men of renown brought them temporary glory, but it didn't save them from the consequences of sin. Their story challenges us to consider what kind of legacy we want to leave behind: a name remembered for its achievements, or a life marked by faithfulness to God. As we continue exploring Genesis 6, keep asking yourself, what does the presence of the Nephilim reveal about the human condition? How do their actions mirror our own struggles with ambition, influence, and morality? And most importantly, how can we resist the allure of fleeting recognition and instead seek eternal significance? By grappling with these questions, we uncover deeper truths embedded in this ancient passage, truths that resonate just as powerfully today as they did thousands of years ago. As we continue our exploration of Genesis 6, it's time to delve deeper into the role of the Nephilim and how Moses framed their presence within the broader narrative. While much speculation surrounds these enigmatic figures, one thing is clear: Moses didn't intend for them to overshadow the central message of the passage. Instead, he used the Nephilim sparingly, almost as a backdrop to highlight humanity's moral decline and God's impending judgment. Understanding this subtle, yet deliberate downplaying of the Nephilim sheds light on both their significance and the larger themes of rebellion and redemption woven throughout Scripture. To grasp Moses' approach, we must consider his original audience, the Israelites wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus. These were people steeped in oral traditions, familiar with ancient stories passed down through generations. The Nephilim weren't obscure figures to them. They were part of the cultural fabric, referenced even later in Numbers 13, when spies reported seeing giants in Canaan. By mentioning the Nephilim briefly in Genesis 6, Moses tapped into shared knowledge without needing to elaborate. He trusted his readers would recognize their legendary status, while focusing instead on the more pressing issue at hand: humanity's descent into wickedness. This minimalist treatment of the Nephilim underscores Moses' primary goal: to emphasize the consequences of sin rather than indulge in tangential details. Notice how Genesis 6:5 shifts abruptly from the Nephilim to a sobering assessment of human corruption. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Here, Moses redirects our attention from extraordinary individuals to universal depravity. The Nephilim, whether giants or heroes, fade into the background because they weren't the root problem. The real issue lay in humanity's collective rejection of God's design. But why include the Nephilim at all if they weren't central to the story? One possibility is that Moses wanted to contrast earthly power with divine authority. The Nephilim represented strength, renown, and influence, qualities often celebrated in ancient cultures. Yet none of these attributes could shield them from the flood's judgment. Their fleeting fame serves as a stark reminder that worldly achievements hold no weight in eternity. What matters isn't how others perceive us, but how faithfully we align ourselves with God's will. Another reason for including the Nephilim may have been to address misconceptions about the source of evil in the world. In Moses' day, polytheistic societies often attributed chaos and suffering to conflicts among gods or supernatural forces. By connecting the rise of the Nephilim to widespread corruption, Moses clarified that humanity's problems stemmed not from external entities, but from internal rebellion. The Nephilim weren't agents of destruction sent by hostile deities. They were products of a fallen creation, reflecting the brokenness introduced by sin. This distinction reinforced the monotheistic worldview central to Israel's faith, a belief in one sovereign God who holds ultimate authority over good and evil. Interestingly, Moses' decision to downplay the Nephilim also reflects humility in storytelling. Rather than indulging in sensationalism or speculation, he prioritized theological truth over dramatic flair. His restraint invites us to do the same, to resist the temptation to chase after mysteries beyond what Scripture reveals. Too often we focus on peripheral questions. Who were the Nephilim? What did they look like? How tall were they? While losing sight of the bigger picture, the devastating impact of sin and the hope of restoration offered through God's covenant. This brings us to a critical takeaway. The Nephilim teach us to examine where we place our trust and admiration. Are we captivated by power, wealth, or celebrity status, believing these things can secure our future? Or do we anchor ourselves in the unchanging promises of God? The fleeting nature of the Nephilim's legacy warns against building our lives on foundations that crumble under pressure. True greatness, according to Scripture, isn't measured by physical prowess or earthly recognition, but by faithfulness to God's purposes. Finally, Moses' handling of the Nephilim challenges us to think critically about how we interpret Scripture. It's easy to get sidetracked by intriguing details, crafting elaborate theories that go beyond the text itself. But Moses reminds us to stay grounded in what God has clearly revealed. When we allow curiosity to lead us astray, we risk missing the transformative truths embedded in His Word. Instead, let's approach passages like Genesis 6 with reverence and discernment, seeking not just answers, but wisdom. In conclusion, the Nephilim play a supporting role in Genesis 6, their presence underscoring the gravity of humanity's moral failure and the futility of relying on worldly power. As we reflect on their inclusion, let's ask ourselves, where am I placing my hope today? Am I pursuing fleeting accolades, or am I striving to live a life that honors God? By keeping our focus on what truly matters, we can navigate the complexities of this ancient text and find enduring meaning for our own journey of faith. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into Genesis 6, it's time to confront one of the most persistent and controversial aspects of this passage: the misinterpretations that have shaped how people understand the Nephilim and the actions of the sons of God. Over centuries, these misunderstandings have fueled myths, legends, and even entire belief systems, some of which stray far from the biblical text. By examining these errors, particularly their connection to the Book of Enoch, we can better appreciate the clarity of Scripture's message about human rebellion and divine judgment. One of the most influential misinterpretations arose during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, a period marked by significant cultural exchange between Jewish communities and Hellenistic influences. During this time, some began associating the Nephilim with giants born from unions between angels and humans. This idea likely drew inspiration from ancient Near Eastern mythologies, where gods frequently interacted with mortals, producing offspring who were larger-than-life heroes or tyrants. While such stories resonated in polytheistic cultures, they clashed with the monotheistic worldview of Judaism. Yet, as Jewish thinkers sought to reconcile Genesis 6 with surrounding traditions, imaginative interpretations gained traction. The apocryphal Book of Enoch became a key vehicle for these ideas. Written around the same era, this non-canonical text expands on Genesis 6, describing in vivid detail how 200 angels descended to earth, took wives, and fathered monstrous giants. These giants, according to Enoch, consumed resources voraciously, wreaked havoc on creation, and ultimately contributed to humanity's downfall. Though fascinating, the Book of Enoch is not part of the Hebrew Bible or accepted Christian canon. Its embellishments reflect human creativity more than divine revelation, offering speculative explanations rather than authoritative truth. Why does this matter? Because attributing evil in the world to angelic sin, as the Book of Enoch suggests, shifts responsibility away from humanity. Scripture consistently portrays human beings as moral agents capable of choosing obedience or rebellion. From Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit to Cain murdering Abel, the Bible traces the origins of sin back to human decisions. Genesis 6 follows this pattern, emphasizing humanity's growing wickedness and God's response to it. The inclusion of the sons of God and the Nephilim adds depth to the narrative, but doesn't absolve humans of accountability. Sin isn't imposed from above, it springs from within. This distinction is crucial because it shapes how we view both history and ourselves. If evil stems primarily from external forces, whether rebellious angels or supernatural entities, then humanity bears little blame. But if Scripture teaches that we are responsible for our choices, then we must grapple with the uncomfortable reality of our own capacity for corruption. The flood wasn't merely a reaction to angelic interference. It was a response to pervasive human depravity. Moses' account reminds us that no amount of power, influence, or extraordinary ability can save us from the consequences of rejecting God's design. Moreover, the rise of these misinterpretations highlights an important lesson about discernment. Throughout history, people have been drawn to sensational explanations, often preferring elaborate theories over simpler truths. The allure of giants, fallen angels, and cosmic battles captivates the imagination. But at what cost? When we elevate extra-biblical texts like the Book of Enoch above Scripture itself, we risk distorting the gospel message. Salvation isn't found in decoding hidden mysteries, It's rooted in trusting God's promises and following His commands. Yet, there's also value in acknowledging why these misinterpretations emerged. They reflect humanity's deep-seated need to make sense of suffering, chaos, and injustice. Faced with questions about the origin of evil, people naturally seek answers, even if those answers lead them astray. Recognizing this struggle helps us approach others with compassion, meeting their doubts and fears with the hope of Christ rather than condemnation. Ultimately, Genesis 6 challenges us to return to the heart of the biblical story, the tension between rebellion and redemption. Whether through the disobedience of the sons of God, the violence of the Nephilim, or the widespread corruption of humanity, sin finds expression in countless ways. Yet amidst the darkness, God remains faithful. He judges rightly, but also extends mercy, preserving Noah and his family as a testament to His covenant love. As we conclude our journey through this complex passage, let's carry forward its enduring lessons. Be wary of interpretations that overshadow Scripture's plain meaning. Resist the temptation to shift blame for sin onto external forces. And above all, remember that true greatness isn't defined by power or fame, but by faithfulness to God. In doing so, we align ourselves not with the fleeting legacy of the Nephilim, but with the eternal purpose of the Creator, who redeems and restores. As we bring this exploration of Genesis 6 to a close, I find myself reflecting on just how much this ancient passage speaks to the human condition. It's remarkable how a text, written thousands of years ago, continues to challenge us, forcing us to confront timeless questions about power, morality, and our place in God's creation. For me, one of the most striking aspects of this story is its unflinching honesty about humanity's capacity for both greatness and corruption. Whether through the mysterious sons of God, the legendary Nephilim, or the widespread wickedness that led to the flood, Genesis 6 reminds us that every choice carries weight, and every action has consequences. The key takeaway from this journey is clear. Sin isn't an external force imposed upon us. It's a reflection of the choices we make when we turn away from God's design. The rebellion described in Genesis 6 wasn't limited to angels or giants. It was rooted in the hearts of ordinary people like you and me. This truth is sobering, but it's also hopeful. If we bear responsibility for the brokenness in the world, then we also have the power to contribute to its healing. By aligning ourselves with God's purposes, we can resist the pull of pride, selfishness, and greed that so often lead to destruction. I want to leave you with a challenge. Don't let this conversation end here. Dive deeper into Scripture, wrestle with the difficult passages, and ask hard questions. Engage in thoughtful discussions with others, whether they share your beliefs or not. And perhaps most importantly, examine your own life. Are there areas where you've overstepped boundaries, pursued fleeting glory, or neglected divine wisdom? Let this story inspire you to live differently, to seek righteousness not for earthly recognition, but for eternal significance. In the end, Genesis 6 isn't just a tale of judgment, it's a call to transformation. It invites us to trust in God's justice while embracing His mercy. It challenges us to build lives that reflect His love rather than our own ambitions. So as you step away from this video, I encourage you to take one small step toward change. Maybe it's reading Genesis again with fresh eyes, praying for guidance, or simply committing to live more intentionally today. Whatever it is, let it be a move toward faithfulness, a reminder that even in a world marked by rebellion, redemption is always possible.